Thank you for moving up. That's great. So my goal is to talk for only 20 minutes and do 40 minutes of Q&A, which I think would be more fun. And I do want to start with something from the introduction, with a quick Vermont history lesson. Sean said that I was the longest serving governor in the history of the state of Vermont. That is actually oddly true, but it's a little quirky. There was a governor named Thomas Chittenden who was served 17 one-year terms. He was the first governor of the state. However, I am the longest serving governor in the history of the state of Vermont because Vermont was an independent republic between 1777 and 1791, and 8 of Governor Chittenden's terms were as an independent republic governor, and 9 years were as a state governor. So I am the longest serving governor in the history of the state of Vermont, but not of Vermont. And I could, if any of you want to read some anybody here really interested in the American Revolution? No. Okay, read the biography of Thomas Chittenden. It's by a Republican, but he was a very liberal Republican. His name is Frank Smallwood, and it's about the American Revolution through the eyes of an independent republic, because New Hampshire claimed half of us and New York claimed the other half. And the machinations that went on were actually wonderful, and if I had more time, I would spend all this time talking about the history of the state of Vermont, which is quirky and funny, but we were also the only state in the country to have, at the time of accession to the Union, a phrase in our Constitution which banned slavery, the only state. Let me talk a little bit, now what I really want to talk about is the impact of your generation on politics, and then we're going to talk about whatever you want in the question period. The reason I want to talk about this is because there's been a huge and fundamental revolution in the country, and almost anything you can think about in sort of current political terms comes from this revolution. And the revolution is actually not an American revolution, although it started here. It is a worldwide revolution. Most of you, obviously all of you in this room, because this is a Penn Democratic, unless there's a few spies here, which I'm sure there are, institute, but most of your generation, in fact, identifies with sort of the causes that you all support. They may not call themselves Democrats. Most of you actually, not people in this room, but most of your generation calls themselves independents and doesn't consider themselves to be Democratic or Republican, but overwhelmingly votes Democratic. And they also overwhelmingly voted for Barack Obama. I think that the history, and you also grew up much differently than we did. My parents were, my father was a World War II veteran, and they were, the kids should be seen and not heard. And we had the revolution of the 60s, which you've probably studied as ancient history, but I had to live through it. And it was an extraordinarily difficult time. While we loved and respected our parents, we didn't talk to them and they didn't talk to us. And we were essentially at war with that generation. I do some writing about this. And Kent State, where 4 unarmed college students were murdered by the National Guard under a right-wing Republican governor, was really a declaration of war. And our generation was, in fact, at war with our own country. And a lot of good things came out of that. And one of the good things, and obviously civil rights, Medicare, Medicaid, all these revolutionary things that were going on, but one of the things that came out of that was a new way of looking at other human beings. We strove to be inclusive. We weren't, but we strove to be inclusive. And I think your generation has grown up with the values, for the most part, of our generation in terms of how you treat other people. But there's a huge difference. There's 2 big differences. The first is that while I was a strong supporter of the civil rights movement and so forth and so on, I didn't know anybody who was black, and I didn't know hardly anybody who was Jewish until I went to college. I had 2 African American roommates when I was a freshman in college. They had never been to school, either one of them, with a white person, because they'd gone to segregated schools in the South, and I had never been to school with a black person. So even though we believed in inclusiveness, we didn't live it ourselves. Not because we chose not to, because that's how we were brought up. Your generation is an extraordinarily diverse generation. I don't call your generation a tolerant generation. I call your generation an inclusive generation. It has changed everything about the way you look at America. For example, among, and I'm sure there is a tiny chapter here, Pennsylvania, Republicans, my guess is that most of those folks have no trouble with same-sex marriage. Why? Because they've grown up with people who were openly gay. We never did. If you said you were openly gay when I went to high school, you'd be lucky to get out of the parking lot in one piece. It's just everything has changed. You have friends, why the Republicans don't do so well, even among young people. Your generation tends, by the way, to be economically libertarian. You could vote for Republicans, except that you have friends of every ethnicity, every immigration status, every religion, and every sexual orientation, and you all date each other. So what the problem the Republicans are having here is that they're not going to throw their friends under the bus for economic reasons. And your generation has accomplished extraordinary things. For example, my generation, we're culture warriors. I'm going to die fighting for the things, the 20% of the stuff I disagree with Republicans on, and we're never getting anything done about the 80% of the stuff we could agree on. You're exactly the opposite. You minimize the 20% of the stuff you disagree on, and you look at the 80% of the stuff you agree on to try to get something done. You're also a very practical generation. Metrics matter. For me, it was ideology. Believe it or not, as a Democrat, I really never liked SDS very much, the Students for Democratic, or whatever S stands for, Society, because they were ideologues. That is, their ideas were really important to them, and if the facts contradicted their ideas, the facts got thrown out so they could keep their ideas up. Now, the right, that's what the right does. But it used to be, there is no left. Don't ever believe anybody from Fox who starts talking about the left wing. I grew up in this country when there was a left wing. There is no left wing in this country now. And when I was growing up, all the whack jobs were on the left. Now they're all on the right. So this is historically, this goes back and forth. But you're not idealized. I know a lot of people your age, because I teach in Hofstra, I teach at UVM, and I teach at Yale. And most of my experiences with people your age is, you may have some core beliefs, and you, in fact, are incredibly idealistic and have accomplished unbelievable things at very young ages, much more so than we did. But when you're on a project and the metrics and the measurements that you use come back and show you that you're not doing something right, you change it. That was not, we weren't so good at that. We had the ideology going, and this is how things should be, and when the metrics came back and showed it didn't work, we didn't change, and that was a mistake. So you've learned a lot in that way. But the most powerful thing that you have going for you is the net. The net has empowered people in this country and around the world in ways that nobody could have ever imagined. Even when I ran supposedly the first, well, it was not supposedly, it was the first really tech-based campaign. First of all, the reason was not because I was so smart about the net, it was because I hired a bunch of 23-year-olds and they could do whatever, let them do whatever they want. And it made all the difference. But what the internet has done is transformed American politics, and it's transforming the entire world. You are, on average, I would guess about 20, more or less. Your older brothers and sisters elected their first president in 2008. It was incredible, Barack Obama. Barack Obama was elected not because there was a big African-American turnout, although there was, not because there was a big Hispanic turnout, which voted more for Obama than people thought was going to happen, although that was true. Obama was elected because for the only time in my lifetime in politics, more people under 35 came out to vote than people who were over 65. I have never seen that happen before. It was an extraordinary thing. Your generation went out and voted and got people to vote, and it was an amazing thing. You've already elected your first president. But there are some other really interesting things that, oh, let me just, before we leave the power of the internet, the internet is more important in the sense that it allows you to bypass institutions which are getting, it's not that the institutions are getting slower, it's just the world is getting faster and they're not keeping up. Washington used to be 5 years behind the times, now they're 15 years behind the times. Not because they've gotten worse, although a lot of people would argue that they had, but simply because time is moving so much faster and they really don't get it. They don't. A few do, but not many. So here's some of the accomplishments of your generation. And maybe there's some people in this room doing things like this. I was judging an internet contest about 4 years ago, and I ran into one of the contestants that I was judging was a young woman from LaGuardia High School in New York City, who for some reason ended up at the University of Vermont. And she found a mentor there. It was a professor who was very interested in emerging democracies and so forth. And so she went to South Sudan when she was 18 years old. And she figured out from her time in South Sudan at 18 years old that American foreign aid made people more dependent, not less dependent, which is exactly true. We have a broken foreign aid model, and it's been broken for a long time. So she decided to do something about it. So when she got back, she wrote to a bunch of foundations and got $1,000 from some foundation in New York at 19 years old, got her roommates and her friend across the hall, and today, at 26, she runs a foundation called Sparks Microgrants, based in Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, empowering African villagers with no electricity and so forth to reinvent themselves. And what she does is, instead of plopping down a project that the community may need, she has a process where she sends folks into the village. They're not allowed to give any advice for 3.5 months, and they have to go through and identify what it is they want. They're getting it at $3,000 one time. That's it, no maintenance. How they're going to maintain it, how they're going to govern it, how they're going to run it every day. And they go through this process, and her name is Sasha Fisher, and what she says is, it's not the project that you're building that makes the difference in their lives. It's the process they have to go through to figure out how to run it. And here's what happens. As you know, most of the societies like that are patriarchal. That is, the men have the power, but the women do the work. And what happens in this 3.5-month process is that in this process of discussioning how are we going to actually get the work done, and how are we going to make it work, and how are we going to govern it afterwards, the status of women in the process rises dramatically. So now women are taking the forefront and the lead in something that's really important to the village. I said to her, you better watch out, because Paul Kagame's not a nice man. When he figures out what you're doing in terms of empowerment, that's when you're going to have to leave Rwanda. But this is an extraordinary thing that a 26-year-old is now running a better model for foreign aid than USAID, who has a budget of billions of dollars. There are thousands of people that are not much older than you all over the world doing exactly these kinds of things. And you studied them. There's a guy in Kenya named Odede Kennedy who grew up in a terrible slum, who partnered with a woman from Denver who he's now married to. And as young people, they basically created this organization which is beginning to lift people out of poverty in one of the worst slums in Africa. And it's not just Africa. There's anti-trafficking work going on in Asia. This is your generation. And how do you do this? It's because of the net. Because the net allows you to bypass institutions. For our generation, we wanted to get elected into office so that we could change the system. Your generation doesn't bother with the system because you don't have to. I'll tell you a quick story about that. Actually, there's a bunch of funny stories, so I'll try not to take too much time. But there was a young woman named Molly Catchpole who graduated from Roger Williams College. Anybody here from Rhode Island? Or nearby? Rhode Island. Okay. Roger Williams College is a working class college. She and her sister were the first in their families ever to go to college. And she went to Roger Williams, graduated right around 2008, in the beginning of the recession. She couldn't find a job. She had lots of student debt. And she's sort of cobbling together babysitting and a little of this and a little of that, living at home. And the Bank of America decides that they're going to charge everybody $5 for the privilege of using their debit cards once a month. So she's furious. Then she goes to change.org, puts a petition up saying, this is what they're doing. Everybody who's willing to take their money out of the Bank of America, sign here. 300,000 people sign. The bank has a fit, and even the president of the bank calls her up and says, well, young lady, you just don't understand. She says, I understand just fine. I got a lot of student loans, and you're just charging me $60 a year for something I was getting for free, and we're not doing it. And so 40 days later, the bank finally decides not to get rid of this fee. 3 days later, for some reason I can't quite understand because it's a really dumb business decision, Verizon decides that they're going to charge everybody $2 to pay your bill online. Now in my generation, we would have paid by check because of course it's 4 times more expensive to process the check, and that would have been our revenge. Molly Catchpole goes back online to change.org, gets 500,000 people who say they're going to switch to AT&T. 2 days after that, Verizon gets rid of their supposed $2 charge to pay your bill. What these corporations are doing is just figuring you're not going to say anything. that some of you will be a little mad, but most of you will just either won't notice or you just pay the $2. And of course, $2 times 50 million subscribers turns out to be a hell of a lot of money. For those of you who didn't pass calculus, it's $100 million, right? Not bad. So, now we could never have done that. We marched and we carried on about the Vietnam War and some big things like that, but it took a long time and several administrations to change things. Our only weapon was carrying on, marching, sometimes not so peacefully, a lot of signs, organizing. Your weapon is your ability to go online and find instant communities to change things. And it gets more serious. That's just a little corporate misbehavior. What about the attack, which is the fight still going on today, the attack on net neutrality by the motion picture industry? So Harry Reid gets one of the very few bipartisan bills. You know, the Democrats and Republicans don't agree on anything in Washington, and they don't play nice together. So they passed a bill that essentially reforms intellectual property laws, which need to be done. But the bill is biased heavily towards content providers, and without getting too technical about intellectual property, what this means is that if you put something up on YouTube that's copyrighted, not only can YouTube sue you and try to make you pay damages, they can also sue YouTube. Not only can the content provider sue you, but the content provider can sue YouTube and hold them liable. It would have destroyed YouTube that would have been the end. You couldn't have used YouTube because you couldn't, there's so many posts a day, you can't keep track of who's got copyrights and who doesn't. 1 million emails were sent to the White House, to Harry Reid, and to the Congress. And being as how all those folks raise money on the internet these days, 3 days later, Harry Reid announced that there would be no vote on this bipartisan bill that had gone to the floor of the Senate. It was unheard of. 3 days it took the turnaround. So the power that you have as individuals is so much greater than it was. I want to finish off this discussion by talking about the downsides. Your generation is an unbelievable generation. And by the way, when I speak about this generation, I never use the word millennials. I call you first globals. Because in fact, the same feelings and organizational talent and determination that went into electing Barack Obama the President of the United States was exactly the same as the kids that did Tahrir Square, exactly the same as some of the kids that rose up against Putin and some of the demonstrations they had against him. And some of these weren't successful, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. But this is a global generation. I was actually in the process of writing a book until my 25-year-old co-author got a job as correspondent with The Economist in Buenos Aires. So that was the end of the book. But I eventually will write it. And so I interviewed all the kids, not all, but a lot of the kids that did Tahrir Square. And then I kept up with them, and I still keep up with them. And so, of course, they were incredibly giddy after Mubarak stepped aside. But then when Morsi came in, the Islamic Brotherhood, and began to become repressive, I called him and I said, what's going to happen? He said, you know, it's going to be okay because we can talk to the second generation of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're a lot like us. They don't believe exactly what we believe, but we can work with them. And because they're young too. And then, of course, El-Sisi came in, and that's worse than Mubarak. And I called him up and I said, okay, you know, we Skype maybe every 6 or 8 months or something. And I said, well, what do you think now? And he said, we're going to win this. He said, we're going to win this because this is a worldwide generational movement. We all believe in the same things. We believe that individuals not only have power in their own lives, but we also believe they deserve the respect. We believe that government works for us and not the other way around. These kids in Tahrir Square learned all the things they eventually learned about from organizing and about civil and human rights, which is what this real movement really was, from going on the net. And their models were Mahatma Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, and Malcolm X. Now, when I was your age, you couldn't possibly have done that if you were an Egyptian and have that motivated an entire movement of young people to change the country. So I'm an incredible optimist about the future of the world, even though I know you aren't. Because no 20-year-olds aren't supposed to be optimists, right? Because every day you see some asshole pushing back on the good stuff that you're trying to do, and it drives you nuts. So I want to leave you with this thought about the power that you have and the change that you are already making far beyond anything we ever did in our generation and that we'll continue to make. So I told you about my roommates in 1967, 68. I was a freshman at Yale. And that was the year Bobby Kennedy was killed. Martin Luther King was assassinated. The Chicago Convention for the Democratic Party blew up because they nominated somebody in the back rooms who hadn't been in a single primary because they didn't like the progressive candidates. If you had, the country was falling apart. If you had told us that in 40 years we'd have a black president, we'd have laughed you out of the room. And 40 years later, to the year, we have a black president. For you, maybe not such a big deal. You grew up, I grew up when people your age were going to segregated schools. In 40 years, now 40 years is twice your lifetime, but 40 years is only 2/3, being generous to myself, of my lifetime. So the message that I just want to close this out with is that it is a daily struggle, especially when you're 20, and you're reading about ISIS and all these horrible things, a daily struggle to think that you can make a difference and the world's ever going to change. When you get a little older, or from your perspective, a great deal older, you look back and you think how fast it all did change. How fast it changes. That 40 years is the time it took between African Americans in the South not being able to vote to having an African American president. Maybe not such a big deal for you who've grown up with every different kind of person you can grow up with. Having a room that looked like this when I was in college never happened. Never would have happened. We were just starting to figure out how to build a diverse nation to represent the diversity that, in fact, the nation was. And it took 40 years. 40 years is nothing. We have a 235-year history as a country. Europe has a 2,000-year history. Mankind has a 7,000 or 8,000-year recorded history. 40 years is nothing. And the change is only accelerating. And I hope you're keeping track, and hopefully backing it up somewhere in case NASA, NSA decides to do unpleasant things to us. I hope you're keeping track of what happens, because someday you're going to tell your children the same thing, that you, when you were in college, you worked hard, and you were disappointed a lot of the times, and sometimes despondent. But in 40 years, everything can change. I can't imagine what the world is going to be like when you're my age, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be pretty extraordinary, and it's going to be even more one world and global than it is today. So thanks very much. I know you expected me to talk about all inside baseball politics, and I am very happy and more than equipped to do so. But I did want to share these thoughts, because I like to do that when I have an audience that's your age. You have tremendous energy and impatience, and sometimes rage and anger, and all those things are incredibly important for generating change, and you can't generate change without them. But once in a while, somebody who's been through the wars can come and tell you that, guess what? Not only do you have to have all those things, you have to have persistence, and every single day you have to get up, no matter how bad or even great it's been the day before, and keep going. And guess what? You will be transformative, and you already have been a transformative generation, and you're not that old. Think what you have in the next 40 years. Thanks very much. Do you want to moderate?
No, people can just make sure you stand up so he can hear you if you're in the back. So you can
comments, questions, and in the tradition of our party, rude remarks as necessary. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Yoni, and I'm studying network and social systems engineering, which is pretty unique. At Penn, it's about the internet society, so I'm interested in that angle. What are your thoughts on the state of civic engagement technologies in the US? And from your experience, how can you incentivize politicians to use technology not just to get elected and to raise funds, but to engage with citizens?
The political system is at a bit of a low point right now. I don't want you to think that's permanent either. We've had this, one of the great things about, I happen to love studying history, particularly American history. You know, we've had worse Congresses than this one. I know that's hard for you to believe. There was a group called the Know Nothings in 1840 who were extremely anti-immigration. Then, in probably the worst Congress we ever had was the Reconstruction Congress, who impeached the vice president for no particular reason other than he was a Democrat and they didn't like him. And so there have been Congresses that have actually been worse than this. And so people ask me, and this is an interesting group because you're obviously interested in politics, so you wouldn't be in this group. People ask me about, how they can get elected, and I say, are you sure you want to? And it's not out of a negative feeling about politics. That's short term. Politics will eventually, at some point, move and catch up and be an institution that moves things again, as it was when Lyndon Johnson, for example, was president. But right now, you guys can get so much done outside the political system. It's a little, it's hard for me to advise you. You should run for the Senate and sit in the Senate for 30 years because your output is probably going to be a lot less than it would be in the next 3 years if you decided to start a charter school or go to Africa and start something like what Sasha Fisher Sparks Micro Grant. I mean, you can do so much now without the institutions. So what about, I'll answer the second question first. When will politicians learn to use the internet for civic engagement? Probably when you're in politics and they're not, which if you're any good will be sooner rather than later. The most important thing for politicians in this system right this moment is getting reelected. And it's a real problem. That's why the campaign finance system is a mess, because not only Republicans are against fixing it, Democrats are too, because they want to get reelected. California is the most extraordinary example of this. In 2010, which was a huge backlash against Democrats, not a single seat changed hands in the California legislature, not one. Why? Because the Republicans and the Democrats got together, made a deal so that every single one of them would keep their seats. I mean, this is ridiculous. So the net of it is not that the country's going to go to hell, because it isn't, because there are thousands of people like you who can go on the net and just build what you want. You don't need politics anymore because the power of the internet allows you to bypass institutions. What's going to happen is they're going to become more and more irrelevant, and eventually the system's going to find equilibrium, and they're going to come back, but they're going to have to totally rethink what government does, which is why I think actually there's a libertarian tendency in your, and I'm not talking about Rand Paul, who I consider to be a nut job. Well, he is. He's about as much, not very libertarian. He's really libertarian about government, except when it has government telling women what they can do in their personal lives. This is not a serious guy here. And a doctor who says that you should be able to decide whether you want, people who don't like the measles vaccine shouldn't be able to have any. I mean, that's, really, please help him. He got his license in a lottery somewhere. So government will change eventually because government will find themselves increasingly irrelevant, which is what has already happened. And then the force always changes from the bottom up. It almost never changes. Even Franklin Roosevelt, who was probably the most activist president we ever had, he did not start a lot of those programs like Social Security. That started out in the States, in the Midwest, because the Depression really did not start in 1929, which we all get taught. It started in 1926 in the farm states because of the collapse of agricultural processes. We always get taught that Wall Street, everything is Wall Street centric, so it started with the crash. Well, the crash happened because in 1926, ordinary Americans on farms couldn't make money. Roosevelt saw that Social Security programs that Kansas and Nebraska and places like that had started, and then he brought them national. So almost all the real change comes from the ground up. It does not come from the top down. It just doesn't. Change doesn't come like that anywhere. Even in authoritarian states, the Chinese, which I know I spent a lot of time in China with the Chinese government, they actually are careful to look at what is going on the ground. This is not a bunch of dictators sitting up here telling everybody what to do all the time. They ultimately have that power, but they're smart, and they pay attention to what's coming from the ground up and then sculpt their policies to accommodate that. And politics is going to do that for a while. So when are they going to figure this out? They'll figure it out. I can't tell you when, but sooner rather than later. In terms of being involved in it and making real change through politics, it's not going to happen for a while. It just isn't. You have to break the model of what they're doing right now and change it. It has to be more collaborative, and I think it will be as your generation gets into politics, because your value is a collaborative value, not a confrontational value. And it has to be more out-of-the-box thinking. And in fact, you probably do need smaller government, not because government's bad, but because you need more flexibility in the institutions in order to make them work in different ways and respond to people like you who have interesting new ideas. Yes, and then in the back.
So you've talked a lot about how the power of the internet is great because it allows us to bypass institutions. But at the same time, since the internet allows people to bypass institutions that are explicitly democratic, while it increases populist power, doesn't it also leave us open to the problem of corporations and even idealistic people coming into a situation where they have more power than they deserve just because they're more efficient?
Great question. The question is about corporate power, and it's a very important question. Corporate power does work through government, and government and corporations have huge influence, more so now than most times during my life. And they have been less responsible recently. Corporations, believe it or not, corporations weren't always behaving the way they do now. Corporations were among the first to integrate their boardrooms. They were among the first to grant same-sex rights as benefits for their employees, long before this was ever written into any legislature's law. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them were actually leaders in things like recycling. So the business community has, from time to time, taken social leadership on. They're just not doing it now. And so there's two ways that we think we can rein in corporate power. One is government. Not going to work. It's not going to work because corporations are multinational and government's not. And a perfect example is this business about exporting Burger King to Canada so they can move their headquarters up there and get a tax break. And other people do it in a different way. Apple does it. Apple keeps their offshore profit. They got $100 million. They're borrowing money here so they can keep their money offshore and make 30% on it because it's not getting taxed. So it turns out that big government is not enough to control big corporations. But there is something that has already been incredibly effective and is not well organized, and that's consumer power. Think what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years. Nike, which used to make all their stuff in really bad conditions in mostly Southeast Asia. They don't do so much anymore because there have been consumer boycotts. Target, the chief executive, gave a big wad of money to some right-wing nut job in Minnesota, and all of a sudden there was a Target boycott, and they decided they weren't going to give any more money to politicians on either side, which is what I recommend. So the way to overcome corporate power turns out to be not by having more government. I'm not against more government. I'm just trying to be practical about this. Why have more if it's not going to be effective? And it hasn't been effective. But it turns out what is effective is going on the net and organizing large numbers of people who are buying people's products. And some of it's hocus pocus. And some of it's a little good but not fantastic. But definitely has moved the needle on corporate responsibility. And some corporations don't care at all. So you have a choice. I don't buy Exxon gas, ever. The reason I don't buy Exxon gas is unless it's in the middle of the night and the needle's on empty, then I give myself a break. Because I don't think it's going to exact enough revenge on Exxon if I have to walk 17 miles in the middle of the night to get gas. But I don't do it because Exxon took over Mobil Corporation. It's now ExxonMobil. Mobil Corporation had benefits for same-sex couples. Exxon got rid of them. I figured that was, I'm not going to affect Exxon's bottom line very much. It just makes me feel better about who I am as a person not to buy Exxon. And there's a few other little things like that. And we can all do that. But imagine if I were to go online and start a campaign, I bet I could get 1 million people to agree not to buy Exxon gas. And somebody's going to do that. And there are already sites that do these kinds of things. You can now go to the supermarket with a scanner and scan a barcode from a product, and your phone will tell you how much money they gave to each party. Now, in your generation, it turns out, other than people in this room, of course, you're not that interested in parties. But suppose it were how much money they spent, or how many times they'd been fined by the EPA for dumping something or other in the river. It would affect your purchasing price. That's the way you're going to control the behavior of multinational corporations, is that kind of stuff. Yes, in the back, in the red.
First of all, let me shake your head before you leave, but I have to ask you this hard question.
Yep.
I was dealing with the computer side of the political things during the Obama first run, and it got down to the superdelegates. Remember that?
Yep.
Okay. The first superdelegate that changed up was Carol Campbell from West Philadelphia.
Was who?
Carol Campbell. She switched over she switched over from Hillary.
Right.
To supporting Barack. And I remember we were sitting around, we were in conversation, they were talking about Barack's possibilities. And I haven't been a computer guy. And that started here at Penn because State Senator Hughes of Pennsylvania, the senior senator, was a librarian at the biomedical school library. So we all knew each other. But so we were in the group, and I kept saying, it looks like Obama is really working Howard Dean's model well. Because you really, in my opinion, were the one who set that model for, let's say, social network computing.
So, okay, so
how much credit do you get for that now?
more than you think. So here's really what happened. I appreciate the kind words, but you know, I didn't know anything. I had 600,000 people base in my state and $160,000 in the bank when we started running for president. So I was not what most people would consider a serious candidate. What we did was we really did hire a bunch of 23-year-olds, usually for nothing for the first 6 weeks, and they redesigned the campaign. And what Obama's, first of all, a lot of my people, I hired them when I took over the DNC, because the DNC was a train wreck. Financially, it was in great shape. McCulloch did a great job, but there was nothing in the building that would be helpful in politics. And so I hired all the people from my campaign who would started their own company, and we built what you described. But what and then Obama hired all those people away from the DNC in 2006. So, what Obama's people, here's the difference between our two campaigns. Obama's people were really disciplined. We were a bunch of young people. I wasn't young, but it was a 23-year-old. We had a hell of a lot of fun. We were not as well disciplined and well organized. We were just making everything up as we went along. Obama's people sat down in a methodical way and looked at everything we did, and all the stuff that we did that went wrong, all the stuff that was a good idea but went wrong, so they should keep, and then the stuff that we did that went right. And David Plouffe, who is a tough guy, might not win the prize for Mr. Congeniality, but he is the most disciplined person I ever met in a political campaign, and I believe that he truly knew where every single voter who was going to vote for Barack Obama was, and he made damn sure every single one of them came out. It was an unbelievable campaign. It is true that did start with our campaign, but you cannot take away any credit from Obama's people. We all steal from each other. I stole a bunch of stuff from the Republicans when I got to be DNC chair in terms of segmenting. So it's all, you know, we all learn from each other. But it is true that our campaign broke the mold. It wasn't me. All I did was say what I thought, which is a very attractive quality for 20-year-olds, because nobody in politics usually does that. Of course, if I hadn't been so blunt, we might be having this meeting in a big room with a blue rug and a little ceiling with it. Yes.
Hi, Governor. I'm Robert Klein. Can you discuss your support for Hillary Clinton in
Sure.
2016?
Yep. First of all, this is not a nasty fight. I adore Elizabeth Warren. I think she's right about the banks. But I've known Hillary for 25 years. And so I'm going to say some things about Hillary that most people won't see unless you know her. First of all, she does not fool herself. Politicians are very good at fooling herself. She is a very, very smart woman who knows a lot and understands herself well. So she may say political things, and of course she does, but she isn't convincing herself that she's not saying political things, and I like that a lot. Second of all, she's a very, very good lawyer. She was on the Watergate prosecution staff of Sam Ervin. I want somebody who's a very, very good lawyer, because I think we've got 5 people who shouldn't be serving on the Supreme Court, and I'd like some justices who actually read the Constitution before they make pronouncements about it. And I have a lot of faith. Third of all, nobody can deny this on either side of the aisle. There is no one in America who is more qualified to be President of the United States. Now, you may not like her, you may dislike her ideas or whatever, but there is no one in America, because the only people who have been in the office can't serve for another 2 terms, right? Because they've already, so there's no one in America, literally, with the resume that Hillary Clinton has and I think the ability to be president. So, you know, normally I would not have done this. And the reason I wouldn't do it is historically we do not go back a generation. Only one time in my lifetime in politics have we gone back, and that was when Carter lost to Reagan. The only time in my lifetime where when you go ahead a generation, then you then go back to another generation for the presidency. I make the exception for Hillary because I think she's our best candidate, but most importantly, I think she'd be the best president. I really do. I think of all the people who could be president, it's not close between her and anybody else for a variety. So that's why I'm supporting her. You know, I am, yes, in the blonde hair, because I am tired of calling on men here. No, you dry out the blonde hair. This is the blonde. Didn't you raise your hand? Oh, that's what I thought. No. All right, I know what it is. The question is how you talk about it. The biggest issue is the demise of the middle class. You cannot talk about it like that because Americans like to be optimistic and like optimists. You cannot say income inequality because that has a whiff of socialism to it. And so we all know that that would be a disaster to talk about that in America. But the truth is, for the last 20 years, the 80% of Americans have not done any better. All the increased wealth has gone to the top 20%. Most of it's gone to the top 1%. This is really astonishing. So it's not that we have envy. I think politicians make an I think Elizabeth Warren makes a mistake. You know, as I say, she's right about the banks. Her rhetoric is not the rhetoric of a presidential candidate. How do I know that? Because I use that kind of rhetoric myself. You can't pillory, we cannot do class warfare. Because most Americans hope that one day they might make a hell of a lot of money and be rich. Most middle class people, when you say let's raise taxes on the wealthy, middle class people think, wait a minute, some people think I'm wealthy. If you raise taxes on the wealthy, the next person in line is raising taxes on me. So we've got to watch our rhetoric, but there is not any question that the middle class in this country is in trouble for a lot of different reasons. And some of them have nothing to do with, you know, greedy corporations and a corrupt Congress. It has to do with the fact that we've globalized our economy and we had wages that were significantly higher than the wages of people we're now competitive with. I think globalizing our economy was a very good thing to do. But in the short term, and I mean 20 years is short term relative to what we've done, it has really been harmful to a lot of people. We've seen a huge change in how you make money in this country, and you don't make money with good manufacturing jobs and high school educations anymore. In the 1950s, you had strong unions. An auto worker who never had a college diploma could rent a cottage on the shore of Lake Michigan. And maybe Henry Ford had a mansion on the shore of Lake Michigan, but this guy was perfectly happy because he thought someday his kids would go to college and they could have a nice vacation by the lake. That's not true anymore. It's much, much tougher. And you know, for those of you who have big amounts of student debt, I don't have to tell you, that's part of this middle class difficulty that we're having. So the biggest issue in the campaign, and who says it right, is going to be it means saying it right matters a lot. You can't just talk about income inequality or the demise of the middle class. You cannot be an alarmist when you're the president, because people want to see somebody who's optimistic and can carry them through. That's more important than anything else, that personal quality. But that is going to be the biggest issue, is what are we going to do about the American middle class and restoring the American dream? Yes, and then we'll work our way back. Yes. Now I'm only getting questions from the right. Yeah, go ahead.
Just as a brief follow-up.
Because nobody else will hear you back there.
Just as a brief follow-up to that, you pointed out education, not only having a high school diploma not being enough anymore. What are your thoughts on Barack Obama's community college plan?
I think that we ought to do two things, both of which would be enormously helpful to the middle class. We ought to not only do what President Obama has suggested, free community college for the first 2 years for those who get a certain average and so forth and so on. I also think we ought to erase half the student loans in this country. And the reason I think so, now we have to find this, you can't just erase it. And I wouldn't want a candidate to say what I just said. Because you got to have a plan, and it's a little tricky. Do you forgive student loans and then they just get more later, or no? You've got to limit that and change the system. But the truth is we have $1.3 trillion worth of student loans. About a little over $1 trillion of that is government backed. At least half of that will never be repaid. So are we going to let that crisis happen and let all kinds of people fall off the map and have people prosecuting people for not paying their loans and destroy lives and cause a big crisis? Or we'll just deal with it now? Just understand, today I'm telling you, no matter what happens, half those loans will not be repaid. It's not possible. So, yeah, it's on our balance sheet. It looks like an asset on our balance sheet, but it's not one. $500 billion will not be repaid. Get rid of them. Now, again, you have to structure it so we don't get back into the problem. You have to have limits on what people can borrow. Who knows? And there's a lot of things that you have to do in order to make that a really viable. Should you get rid of student loans for people whose parents make $1 million a year? That's not really an issue, because of course people whose parents make $1 million a year don't have student loans. But you have to have a well thought. But those are two things that would incredibly help the middle class and working class kids get what you really have to have to be competitive, which is a college education.
Could I ask a brief follow-up?
Yeah.
Do you think that...
Just so, for the benefit of everybody in the back.
So my mother's a community college professor, and her thought, I was surprised when she told me this, but she's actually against it. She was saying she believes that by making community college free, that you're going to get rid of a lot of the incentive. If people aren't working hard for their degree, she feels that they're not going to make the most of it. And furthermore, she's saying that there are a lot of people who they should be focusing more on trade school as opposed to academics, and maybe this isn't necessarily pushing people in the right direction.
Two really great points. The first is, if we make community college free, does that disincentivize people to do any work? Because they can now go for free, so they don't have to put anything in. And the second is, don't we really need trade schools? So I'll answer the second question first. The answer is we do really need trade schools, and community colleges need to be more trade schools, and they're going to be. Not only are community colleges. As I said, I teach at the University of Vermont sometimes. They now have an entrepreneurship program where they have to run their own business junior year and senior year. They have to have a business plan for a real business. I mean, so those kids are going to come out of there with a degree that's immediately employable. If you go to Penn, you probably can get away without doing that, but there are not many places that you can graduate from and not have skills. That's why people are majoring in science and engineering as opposed to, you know, philosophy and English, because it's so hard to get a job. And again, unless you go to a place like this where you can go on to law school or whatever. So I think what you're going to see in college education is a tremendous changeover, because I think the market, the price is so high that unless you can come out of school with a marketable skill, those places, there are going to be a lot of places that go broke as a result. Now, the next issue is a really interesting one, because you're not the only person that said that to me. And will people, if you give something away for free, is that what people value it at? And there is a certain amount of correctness to that. The person who said that to me that really got my attention was a young lady from the inner city who didn't have any money whatsoever. And she was at a charter school, and she said the same thing you did. I don't think it should be free, because if we do, community colleges will be flooded by people who are just there because it's free. You could charge. I mean, you could charge $100 a year. That sort of token payment might make some difference. You could also, as the president has suggested, require a certain average. If you get below it, it's not free anymore. So there are ways to deal with that. I do think that community colleges are incredibly underused, though. And I think, and they're actually becoming more used now, because there's a ton of kids, especially in places like California, which have a really solid community college program. Say they want to go to Berkeley, and they've got good grades, but it costs, you know, $45,000, $50,000 a year. They go to community college for next to nothing. They get straight A's in 2 years of community college. Now they only have to pay for 2 years at Berkeley instead of 4. And that's going on in every state in the country. Michigan is another place. You want to go to Michigan State or the University of Michigan, which is a great university. It's expensive. You go to community college for 2 years, do really well. That's another incentive. Whether you're paying or not is not going to have an effect on how much work you do if you want to go to the University of Michigan from a Michigan junior college. So it's complex, and there are going to be, believe me, there will be people in Congress who raise the same issues that you do. I still think it can be done. I think it should be done, but that's why there is a Congress, is so that we can start thinking about issues like that and tweak them. Just because the president says it has to be this way, his idea is to put the big idea in, and then we can fiddle with it after we get some other people to think about it, which is why you have a representative democracy. All the way in the back, in the plaid shirt.
What is your opinion on why the 2014 elections had the lowest voter turnout in decades?
Two reasons why, at least for my thinking. The first was people were mad at Obama. His numbers weren't very good, and it is a referendum on the president to a certain extent. The second is the Democrats ran probably the worst campaign I ever saw, maybe with the exception of 1994. If your opponent's platform is, we're against Barack Obama, and your platform is, well, we don't like him either, why would you vote for somebody? Bill Clinton, who I still consider the finest political mind in the country, once said that if people will always vote for someone who is wrong and strong before they'll vote for somebody who is weak and right. And we may be right in our ideas, but you've got to stand for something in politics. That's why my campaign took off. It wasn't because I was such a well-organized person. It was because I was they basically, actually it turns out, now that I've had 12 years to think about it, I realize now I was running against the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. I was running against the Democrats who all voted for the Iraq War and Bush's tax cuts, both of which really hurt the country for a very long time. We're not out of it yet. So the reason I drew people your age to my campaign is because people your age aren't so high on the scale of hypocrisy as people my age are, and people your age really appreciate when somebody just says what's obviously true, even though saying what's obviously true is not always a political virtue. It usually is a good human virtue, and I think people your age are more tuned into sort of basic common sense how you treat each other stuff. So that, we made it terrible. I mean, we just screwed up time after time after time. There were some people who ran good campaigns who didn't win. I deeply regret. Kay Hagan probably ran the best campaign of anybody I know and lost to an imbecile in North Carolina. He really isn't, and he had no right to win because he was the speaker that presided over the most far-right agenda in the country, including taking away the right to vote for thousands of people in North Carolina. So, it was in some ways a wave election, but a lot of it was the Democratic message was really appalling. In Kentucky, it was going to be tough to beat Mitch McConnell, and we had a decent candidate. But she allowed the last 2 weeks of the campaign to be a discussion about whether she did or did not vote for Barack Obama for president. You know what the right response is? Of course I voted for Barack Obama for president. He's a Democrat, I'm a Democrat. And by the way, you're a Republican. Have you done anything for anybody in Kentucky lately? Because you've been spending all your time in Washington kissing the ass of big corporations. What do you think about that, Mr. McConnell? Guess what? I think she probably could have said that in Kentucky, and that people would love that, right? But instead, arguing about whether, look, just be who you are and say who you are. You don't have to defend Obama, but you got to tell the truth. And after all, the plain truth of the matter is, although people in Kentucky probably don't believe this, is that Obama's a hell of a lot better than any alternative they could have ever dreamed up. And Mitch McConnell's ratings weren't a hell of a lot better than Obama's. So how did we lose that race? We lost it because she became afraid. And if you're afraid to lose, you gotta. You cannot be afraid to lose in this business. There is something worse than losing. And what's worse than losing is winning and spending 30 years of your life standing for nothing so you never lose. Why be in politics if you're afraid? Don't tell me you're going to go into politics and change things. You're going to change nothing if all you're worried about is saving your own seat. Nothing. Which is why I think for a while it's a good thing that we don't all rush into politics, because I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much we change outside politics. Yes, and then over here.
As a physician and a politician, where do you see healthcare going in the next 20 years?
Well, I don't know. I used to have more firm views about this. I have mostly been, I'm not a fan of the Affordable Care Act. I think it was really screwed up awfully from beginning to end. I mean, they could have done, what they really should have done is expanded Medicaid to cover everybody under 25, expanded Medicare to let everybody sign up for it who wanted to, and then left the insurance business alone. And people would have chosen their own, and everybody understands regular insurance, Medicare, and Medicaid. So you don't have the, oh my God, what are you doing factor. And it would have been so much easier. And we came within one vote in the Senate of having a public option to use Medicare for everybody if you wanted to. And I think that's what we should have done, but we didn't, and we are where we are. There's one thing in the bill that's going to change everything, unintentionally, because I don't think anybody thought about this when they voted for it. And that's something called the ACO, the Accountable Care Organization. The ACO is essentially the vertical integration of healthcare. From the person who clips your grandmother's toenails in the nursing home to the person who does open heart surgery, all in the same organization. They did it because they thought that if you did that, you'd share electronic medical records and everybody would know what had to be known, so you didn't have any ugly surprises. Like if your grandmother got her toenails clipped and there was a little infection in her toe, that is not the time to do heart surgery. And it's, a lot of stuff like that falls through the cracks in our system because it's so diverse and so what's the word I'm looking for? Chopped up. That's not the word I'm looking for, but you get it. So, but if you have a vertically integrated healthcare system, you can theoretically go on the insurance market and sell your product for a fixed fee. And until we get away from fee-for-service medicine, we're never going to have healthcare reform in this country. What you saw was insurance reform. Getting rid of the ban on pre-existing conditions, charging everybody the same whether you're 25 or 55. That's all insurance reform. There was no healthcare reform. But healthcare could be reformed in the private sector, which is what this bill was. This is a private sector bill basically for the benefit of the insurance companies, basically is what it is. It did insure more people, which is good. It did complicate a lot of things. But if an ACO can go on the exchange and offer a product for a fixed fee, it eliminates the insurance companies. Or actually, what you're seeing now is the merger between insurance companies and hospitals, one taking over the other emerging. Why? Because if I get a fixed fee, all of a sudden I have cost control. We haven't had cost control in this country for 50 years, and there's none in Obama's bill, despite their protestations to the contrary. The way to have cost control is I'll give you a budget, and that's the budget you're going to live with. And if the same person who's taking the insured risk is also providing the care, which is not the system we have, because the insurance companies are essentially the intermediaries, if you get rid of that, all of a sudden you get rid of fee-for-service medicine, you have predictability in the budget. And that could happen. Kaiser is an example of this. Cleveland Clinic, I think, does this. Geisinger does it in Pennsylvania. There are places that already do it. But the budget predictability is important for two reasons. First of all, it controls costs, which is the biggest problem we have. 2 times, 3 times the rate of inflation for 30, 40 years. But more importantly, we get paid when you get sick. And we get paid whether what we do or not works. I mean, whether it works or not. And we get paid by doing as much as we possibly can to you, whether it does or doesn't work. If that system were to be gotten rid of, that's the fee-for-service medicine, we would get paid for keeping you out of the hospital. Because instead of ICU beds and MRI machines and cardiac cath machines being big profit centers, now they would be big loss centers. So the less high-tech stuff you use, the better. Well, there'll always be crooks, as there are in this system. In this system, they run the bill up. In the other system, they just wouldn't give you necessary care. That's bad, but you can regulate that. But the real incentive is, if you're 25 years old and you have diabetes, I get paid now to manage your diabetes so you never need dialysis, which I have to pay for, not the patient. That is why you got to get rid of fee-for-service medicine. And nobody was willing to do that in the Affordable Care Act. But they set in motion some potential changes in the system that could result in the private sector getting rid of fee-for-service medicine. And that would be an enormous step towards real healthcare reform, because I don't think you're ever going to get real healthcare reform without controlling costs. How you can continue to raise something like this, 20% of the gross national product, 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation, it's just not doable. And either we're going to have a terrible system with lousy care, which happens when systems break down, or we're going to rationalize it ahead of time. And we've now given the private sector the means to rationalize it ahead of time, and I think it's going to be fascinating what happens. I said somebody, where is it? Oh, you were, yes.
You mentioned in your introduction about your 50-state strategy that you implemented as the DNC chair. Would you think the Democratic Party has to reintroduce that, especially with our huge losses in the state legislature?
Yes, the 50-state strategy was based on the idea that there are Democrats everywhere, and you've got to give them some hope. I started when I was running for president, where I conceived it. Although I conceived when I was running for governor, I'd always spend plenty of time in the parts of the state I knew I wasn't going to win. For 2 reasons it's important. One is there are Democrats in Utah and Idaho. And if your attitude is, I'm going to get those states someday, that's fine. But as Lao Tzu said, the longest journey begins with a single step. There's a lot of talking, but not much single steps to start the journey. So if you want to get Utah in 20 years, you've got to start now. And that means we've got to put resources in Utah and have them have a Democratic Party that works. So that's the first thing, is the 50-state strategy is designed to have viable Democratic parties everywhere. And that is something we had desperately needed this time. The worst loss that we took in 2014 was not the Senate. It was state legislatures. We lost over 300 seats in state legislatures. There are 26 states which are controlled entirely by Republicans, governor, Senate, and House. That is not going to change for a very long time. We could flip the Senate in 2016. But we're not going to, and the tragedy in the state legislatures is the 50-state strategy was thrown out the window, and nobody spent any money in Texas. Why? Because Texas was going to go Republican, so why invest in it? Well, why invest in it is because you don't want to lose all those legislative seats, or Kansas, or Nebraska, or Utah, or all these places that people think of as red states. Red states are made up of red people and blue people, just like New York is made up of red people and blue people. The proportions are different, but you've got to feed your own base and get them enthusiastic, and you can't do that without being there. So that was the first piece of it. The second is chance favors the prepared mind. Louis Pasteur. Don't ever forget that. Chance favors the prepared mind. It'll be useful no matter what you do in life. You can't know what's going to happen in your life, whether it's political or anything else. You can't predict. Life is full of surprises, both good and bad, but if you're prepared, you're more likely to be able to take advantage of whatever happens. So I'll give you an example. So I flew up to Alaska. Some asshole from the Chicago Tribune made fun of my trip, who I don't like at all. He's now working for ABC News. You may occasionally see him. So he wrote a story, a snotty little story about, my going to Alaska and wasting the donors' money. And I went up and I found out we had good people, but they didn't have any money, and they didn't have any list. So we put some money in. We got their list together. We got the whole we built a national list of all the Democrats, and we let them choose their people, but we got to train them 5 times a year. And they developed some pretty good competence. Next year, a young guy who was the mayor of Anchorage, who had half the population of the state, decided to run for the Senate against Ted Stevens, which was a total fool's errand, because Ted Stevens was the Robert Byrd of Alaska, just pumping tons of money in. Except that Ted Stevens got indicted. And then Ted Stevens, of course, wouldn't listen to his lawyer, so he demanded an immediate trial so that he would be found innocent, and he was found guilty. And we got a Democratic senator from Alaska. Now that would not have happened. We obviously had nothing to do with getting Ted Stevens indicted, but we had a lot to do with making sure that he was able to run a competent campaign with all the things that you need in a modern campaign. Chance favors the prepared mind. All of a sudden, bang, we have a Democratic senator from Alaska that nobody expected. And things happen in the world. If you're not prepared for them, you're unlikely to be able to take advantage of it. Are you the timekeeper?
No, it's just.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
So one thing you noted, obviously,
We'll leave you with the last question, because it is, I've gone into overtime, I see.
You noted the demise of the middle class, and that'll be.
Hey, we won't use the word demise. I made that up, and that's a very bad word. Yes, the struggles of the middle class.
But
the rebuilding of America's middle class. How about that?
We've seen, historically, it's trending recently, more and more, especially middle-class whites are voting Republican, and the Democratic coalition is much more minority-based and more white women, predominantly. So I'm wondering, in light of everything that's going on in Ferguson, throughout the country, and kind of that white middle-class defection from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, how you see, Hillary Clinton or Democrats in general, nationwide, kind of trying to, bridge the racial gap a little bit, but also with that economic message focused on the middle class.
Well, I think there's a difference between white working class defections and middle class defections. Middle class defections are not about race, they're about taxes. White working class defections are about race. That's not going to change, but the numbers of white working class people are dropping dramatically. And the number of people of color in this country is rising dramatically. This is going to be the first year, by the way, in the history of the United States where there are going to be more children of color entering kindergarten than there are white kids. And in 2050, there will be no majority in this country. In California today, the most populous state in the country, there is no majority. Nobody's in the majority in California. So that's the future of the country. I don't worry a lot about the middle class defections. I think we can get them back, partly because although the Republicans are becoming more disciplined and leadership is desperately trying to steer them to a more centrist path, it's going to be really hard, especially economically. And partly because I believe that we can learn not to talk about taxing people all the time. You just can't, look, you can talk about raising taxes on the wealthy people if you want to. You're going to lose elections if you do it. As I said before, when the average middle class person hears the Democrats want to raise taxes on the wealthy, and their taxes just went up. People always think their taxes went up. Even when they get a tax cut, they think their taxes went up. That's why we lost middle class people in 2014. Now I read that same article you did today, and the truth is I would have liked to see the stats behind that article, because I think what really happened was you saw a huge fall off in voters. So those middle class, including middle class people, so those middle class people that did vote could well, depending on what the stats behind the article were, which we don't know, could well have simply been a representation of nothing more than a skew among middle class voters, so more Republicans voted. That's just as possible as this thesis was that people didn't like taxes, and the person who wrote it rushed out and interviewed 3 people. Well, 3 people in a country of 310 million people is not exactly a statistical sample. So it was a very interesting article. I hope it scares Democrats, because I think we do have to worry about defections from the middle class, but I'm not exactly in the all is lost camp. I think we just need to do more work on that. But we could be in trouble. We just got to stop talking about taxing people. We have got to get out of this mindset that wealthy people are our enemy. They are not our enemy. What's our enemy is people who sell their political souls to a small number of people for their own political benefit. That's what is killing us. It's great to have wealthy people as long as they behave themselves. Now, what's going on Wall Street is not good, because Wall Street is no longer a good place to allocate capital. It's a place to play games by betting on interest rates and credit default swaps and all these things. That didn't used to be, and hopefully Wall Street will one day be restrained so that it will do what it's supposed to do in a capitalist society, which is allocate capital in an effective, efficient way. So, but I still don't think it pays to point the finger and blame people in a populist way. Americans are populist about social issues, but not very populist about wealth. Because, as I said, we were all founded on this idea that this was a land of opportunity, and if we can make more money, a lot of people would like to do that. And I don't begrudge that. I begrudge people bending the rules to suit themselves. That is a very potent political issue. Attacking the Koch brothers is a really smart thing to do, because that stands for what's wrong with America. But attacking wealthy people in general is a mistake, because everybody knows people who have been very generous and helpful and thoughtful, and that doesn't work. I think that's actually one of the reasons we got creamed. Not only do we run away from who we were, or from our leader, for better or for worse. If you're running away from your own leader, it just doesn't look good, even if the leader has made some mistakes and is in lousy shape. As Harry Truman once said, you can run a real Republican against a Democrat who votes like a Republican, and the real Republican wins every time. It doesn't pay for us to take chapters out of their playbook. We should stand up for who we are. That's an incredibly attractive thing, and it's something that's attractive to people in politics who don't think politicians stand for anything. I think really, if you want to win, we can win big in 2016. We just have to stand for what we believe in and not let pollsters tell us what to say. Thanks very much.